Hello, my name's Helen Peters, and when Candy Goulet told me about the Corona Diary project, I was really pleased, mainly because I use diaries all the time in my writing. So I think it's a great time to keep a diary and will be an amazing record in the future. I use other people's diaries all the time, published diaries, when I'm researching books. So in my book, Anna at War, here, which is about a girl in 1939 and 1940 who travels over from Germany on the Kindertransport. I used a lot of diaries of people at the time to help me write the book. And the reason why diaries are so great is because it's living history. People have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, so they just write what happened today with no hindsight, with none of that wisdom that comes with knowing how things turned out, like in history books. They are just writing what they see, hear, feel at this time, not knowing what the future holds. So they're the most honest record that you have when you're researching a book about how people really lived and felt at the time of your story. The one I use most is probably the most famous diary of all time, or one of them, which is the Diary of Anne Frank. Anne was in her early teens when she kept this diary. She was in hiding from the Nazis with her family in a tiny attic, and she wrote the most amazing diary. She was doing practically nothing. She could never go outdoors. She would look out of the window, and she wrote about what she saw out of the window, about the relationships with her family in this tiny space they were cramped up in, about the other people they were in hiding with and how she felt about them, and about herself, about how she felt about this strange new life she was living that she'd never expected, about her fears, her hopes for the future, because of course she hoped that when the war was over, she would get out and live a long and happy life. And reading that diary is very moving and an incredibly inspiring experience. She had no idea that diary would ever be published, and now it's sold 35 million copies. I'm not expecting you to write a diary necessarily that will do that, but it will be incredibly interesting for you to read your diary in a few months' time, in a few years' time, when you're old like me and you look at your childhood diaries, everything about it, the notebook you wrote in, your handwriting, everything you wrote, however dull it seemed at the time, will bring back so many memories when you read it in the future. And you never know, it may help another writer to write a book. There are a couple of other diaries I used. Nella Last's War, Mrs. Miles's diary. They both kept those diaries in the Second World War. And again, they had no idea how the war was going to turn out. So they talk about, they were writing in England, and they talk about their worry that the Nazis will invade, how long the war might last for, how hard it is to get onions in the shops, queues for the bakers, the kind of things that strangely, people are worrying about at the moment as well, that we never expected to have to worry about. So in your diary, what would you write? I would say there are no rules. Of course there are no rules, it's your diary. It's entirely unique and up to you. I would say be as honest as you can, because the more honest you are in your diary, the more interesting it will be to read later. That's one of the things that Anne Frank's diary is so great for. It's so honest because she wrote it secretly. She wrote hers, and here's an interesting tip here. She wrote hers as if it was letters. So she wrote to an imaginary friend called Kitty. So each entry starts with, there you go, dearest Kitty. And she found that easier than just writing a diary. It was as though she had somebody to write to, a really good friend who she could trust and who would never spill her secrets. So that's a tip. Maybe write it as though you're writing letters to an imaginary friend, a perfect friend who will never betray you and who you can tell everything to. Another tip I have, if you're wondering what to write about, is think about senses. So think about maybe looking out of your window, or when you go on a walk, when you go to the shops, even in your room. Think about writing what you can see, what you can hear, what you can smell, what you can taste, what you feel, because those kind of things are very evocative and useful when you come to reading it later, or when anyone else comes to read it and you're conjuring up what life was like. The only time as an adult I've ever kept a kind of diary is this little notebook here. I've got a few of these actually. This is just one of them to show you. When I was writing my first book, The Secret Hen House Theatre, it's set on a farm where I grew up, and every month for a year I went back to that farm and I wrote about the sensory experiences of it from month to month. So I looked at the changing seasons, you know, what flowers were out, what trees were in leaf, what the weather was like. And I wrote about it as plainly as I could. I think that was the best tip I ever had. Just write what you see, what you hear. Don't try and write it in fancy language, just write the basics. So in this little notebook, I would stand in the farmyard and just scribble down what I could see, what I could hear. Maybe if it was raining, you know, how do I hear the rain? Is it splashing on the tin roof? Is it splashing into puddles? Has it made the brickwork grow darker with the wet? What does the mud look like? I noticed that the mud had all these spiky chicken footprints in it, which I'd never noticed before, and I'd lived on that farm 18 years. So there's all kinds of things you notice when you start thinking about your senses. And my final tip would be to write whatever you want, whatever's interesting. Even if it seems boring now, actually, it won't seem boring when you write it in the future. And just be as honest as you can and enjoy it. Stay safe and happy writing.